2 days before Thanksgiving, my family texted me not to come. My sister's new husband claimed I ruined the vibe. They thought they were simply brushing off a quiet sister. They had no idea I held the exact internal corporate files that could demolish his career and their fake luxury lifestyle. I did not argue. I just smiled and opened his folder. Soon, he will wish he never spoke my name. My name is Morgan Morales. I am 36 years old, and I live in a high-rise apartment overlooking the Charles River in Boston. I am a woman who values silence, structure, and absolute discipline. These traits are not just personal preferences. They are the foundation of my career at Halcyon Transit Group, a private logistics empire where I operate at the executive level. My life is meticulously organized. I do not tolerate mess, whether it is in corporate acquisitions or my own living room. Yet, for years, my family has been the one chaotic variable I allowed to exist. I was the quiet pillar. I was the one who absorbed the impact whenever they stumbled. When my father needed surgery and his insurance fell short, I paid the medical bills. It was not a small amount. It was tens of thousands of dollars transferred without a single complaint from my end. When my younger sister, Vanessa, decided she needed a luxury apartment to match her social ambitions but lacked the credit and the cash, I provided the deposit. That deposit was equivalent to 3 months of my own salary at the time. When my mother maxed out her credit cards trying to maintain a lifestyle she could not afford, I quietly cleared the debt, absorbing the financial blow so she would not face embarrassment. I did these things not for praise, but because it was what a responsible daughter and sister did. I asked for nothing in return. I certainly never expected gratitude, but I also never expected to be discarded with such casual cruelty. It happened exactly 2 days before Thanksgiving. The sky over Boston was an unforgiving shade of gray, threatening an early winter storm. I was standing in my pristine kitchen, holding a cup of black coffee, when my phone vibrated against the cold marble counter. It was a message in the family group chat. I opened it, expecting a question about whether I was bringing the usual expensive wine from that vineyard in Napa. Instead, I found a dense paragraph from my mother. She typed that it would be best if I did not attend dinner this year. She explained that Vanessa's new husband, Grant Holloway, felt my presence brought a controlling energy to the room. He claimed I made everyone uncomfortable with my quiet judgment and my refusal to engage in their trivial gossip. My mother suggested that since I was always so busy with work anyway, I might enjoy a peaceful evening alone in the city, sparing them the tension. Before I could process the sheer audacity of her words, a second message appeared. It was from Vanessa. My sister chimed in to support her new husband. She declared that this year, Thanksgiving was going to be an elevated experience. She said they were aiming for a sophisticated, relaxed atmosphere, implying that someone like me, a woman who supposedly only knew how to work and judge others, simply did not fit the aesthetic. Vanessa Morales Holloway had always been the golden child, the one allowed to make mistakes, the one perpetually shielded from consequences. Now, armed with a flashy new husband who wore designer suits and talked in circles, she felt empowered to exile the very person who had funded her safety net for her entire adult life. I waited for my father to intervene. I stared at the bright screen, expecting him to type a reprimand, to remind them who had paid for his heart medication, who had kept a roof over their heads during the rough years when his business failed. Instead, a tiny notification popped up indicating he had reacted to Vanessa's message with a sign of approval. A simple digital thumbs up. That was it. No defense, no hesitation. It was a collective decision. They had voted me off the island, trading the daughter who bled for them for a man who spoke in slick marketing jargon and leased luxury cars to look important. I did not reply. I did not type out an angry paragraph demanding an explanation. I did not call my mother to cry or beg for my seat at the table. I simply locked my phone and set it face down on the counter. I walked into my living room and looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows. The Charles River was dark and turbulent below. Reflecting the heavy clouds, I felt a strange, cold clarity wash over me. For the past 7 years, I was the one who funded the major holidays, I bought the imported turkeys, the vintage wines, the elaborate floral centerpieces. I paid for the flights when we traveled to see extended family. I subsidized the very memories they now wanted to exclude me from. They genuinely believed they were just brushing off a difficult, single, introverted relative. They thought they had finally outgrown their need for my wallet. I let out a slow, quiet breath. The chill of the glass against my fingertips grounded me. I turned away from the view, leaving the silence of the living room, and walked down the hall to my home office. My desk was a sanctuary of absolute order. Neatly stacked in the center was a thick, confidential dossier. It was an internal investigation file concerning a string of severe operational violations at a subsidiary company that Halcyon Transit Group was currently in the final stages of acquiring. My role in this massive acquisition was to find the rot, cut it out, and restructure the entire management team. It was a ruthless process involving millions of dollars, and I was exceptionally good at my job. I sat down in my high-backed leather chair and opened the heavy cover of the file. I bypassed the executive summaries and the financial projections, flipping directly to the Human Resources Addendum. This section contained the roster of regional management personnel who were flagged for special review. These were the men and women who were suspected of exploiting corporate loopholes, inflating operational costs, and running extravagant personal expenses through company accounts. I scanned the list of names, my eyes moving quickly down the columns of middle managers and regional directors. Suddenly, my gaze locked onto a familiar arrangement of letters. I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second, leaning closer to the stark white page. There it was, printed in crisp, undeniable black ink. Grant Holloway, Regional Director. He was right there, sitting squarely in the middle of the termination and fraud investigation pool. The shock that coursed through me had nothing to do with the fact that Grant worked within that corporate system. He had always vaguely boasted at family dinners about being a major player in regional logistics, securing massive contracts and commanding a huge fleet. The true seismic impact of this discovery lay in the sheer, poetic irony of the situation. The man who had just convinced my family that I was too unpleasant to sit at their Thanksgiving table had absolutely no idea who I really was. To my parents and my sister, I was just a mid-level office manager who lived a boring, unglamorous life. They never bothered to ask about my exact title. They never asked about the scope of my responsibilities. They did not know I was the Chief Risk and Integration Officer, the executive architect of this entire corporate takeover. They did not know that my job allowed me to see deeper than anyone else into the financial concealment network behind his flashy facade. I had the maximum security clearance to track every single dollar he spent, every vendor contract he approved, every fraudulent expense report he submitted to maintain his illusion of wealth. Grant Holloway was playing the role of a wealthy, successful family man, impressing my parents with his leased cars and expensive dinners, but he was standing on a fragile trapdoor, and my hand was resting firmly on the lever. I leaned back in my chair, staring at his name on the confidential document until the letters seemed to burn into my retinas. A slow, genuine smile formed on my lips. It was the first time I had smiled all day, a sharp expression devoid of any warmth. My mother wanted a peaceful holiday without my judgment. Vanessa wanted an elevated experience with her perfect new husband. Grant wanted the controlling energy gone so he could dominate the room unchecked. They were going to get exactly what they asked for. I would not ruin their Thanksgiving dinner. I would let them eat their expensive turkey, drink the wine I was not there to pay for, and post their carefully staged, perfect family photos on social media. I would let Grant play the king of the castle for one more long weekend, because on Monday morning, when the acquisition transition officially began, I was going to systematically and legally dismantle his entire life. Growing up in our household, the roles were assigned early and carved into absolute stone. Vanessa was the fragile, beautiful bird that required constant tending, protection, and applause. She was raised to be an ornament, someone whose primary contribution to the world was her aesthetic appeal and her dramatic emotions. I, on the other hand, was the sturdy foundation, I was the child expected to bear weight without ever showing a single crack or demanding a moment of sympathy. Whenever a crisis hit the family, my parents did not look to Vanessa for a solution. They looked directly at me. It was a silent, suffocating contract that I signed simply by being born the older, more capable daughter. I was the reliable one. Reliability, in my family's deeply flawed dictionary, translated directly to a complete absence of personal needs or boundaries. I was expected to be the infinite well they could draw from, never asking how the water got there. Then Grant entered the picture, bringing with him a tornado of superficial charm. They had been married for less than 8 months, but he had already completely rewired the family dynamic to serve his ego. Grant was an intoxicating illusion for people who were desperate to climb a social ladder they could not afford. He spoke in a relentless stream of corporate buzzwords, aggressive optimism, and name-dropping. He drove a pristine, imported sports car that I knew with absolute certainty was tied to a 36-month lease with a punishing mileage penalty. His social media feeds were meticulously curated galleries of his supposed elite lifestyle. He posted photos from overpriced steakhouses, VIP airport lounges, and exclusive golf courses where he was clearly only playing as a guest. My parents swallowed this performance whole. They were mesmerized by the shiny veneer of a man playing the role of a modern aristocrat. To my mother and father, my own existence had become something of a tragic disappointment compared to this new, glittering son-in-law. Sure, I paid my bills on time and never asked them for a dime, but they frequently whispered that I simply did not know how to truly live. I did not wear recognizable designer labels dripping with logos. I drove a sensible, 5-year-old sedan that I owned outright. My apartment was minimalist, devoid of the flashy gold accents and velvet furniture Vanessa plastered all over the internet. Therefore, in their eyes, my success was a dull, uninspiring thing. Grant, on the other hand, was a trophy. He was the glittering prize they could finally parade in front of the neighbors. He was the definitive proof that they had finally made it into the upper echelon of American society, even if that echelon was entirely fabricated and funded by crippling, hidden debt. The hypocrisy of their admiration tasted like ash in my mouth. Just 12 months prior, my mother had tearfully summoned me to her house to confess a massive, negligent oversight regarding the business taxes for her struggling boutique. The state revenue department was threatening a civil lawsuit and the immediate seizure of her personal assets. It was a terrifying sum of nearly $45,000. She wept, she hyperventilated, and she begged me not to let her face public ruin. I did not lecture her. I simply wired the money directly to the tax authority within 48 hours, erasing the disaster completely. Yet, at the following Sunday dinners and holiday gatherings, there were never any toasts to my quiet, rapid intervention. There were no proud mentions of my financial capability to our extended relatives. My rescue mission was treated like a shameful, dirty family secret that needed to be buried deep underground. Meanwhile, when Grant casually gifted my father a $200 bottle of blended scotch, it was celebrated for weeks as an act of sheer, undeniable class and generosity. Vanessa was cut from the exact same entitled cloth. Roughly 2 years ago, long before Grant even existed in her orbit, she showed up at my door sobbing uncontrollably. She claimed she was going through a brutal life transition, drowning in essential living expenses, and desperately needed a substantial cash infusion to survive a tough phase. Because we shared blood, I wrote her a personal check for $15,000. I expected her to use it for rent, utilities, and perhaps some therapy. Exactly 4 weeks later, I watched her post an endless stream of photos from a 5-star eco-resort in Costa Rica, posing in custom swimwear. When she returned, she invited our parents over to show off the imported rattan furniture she had just purchased for her living room. The money I had accumulated through relentless 60-hour work weeks was vaporized on her aesthetic whims and couples vacations. When I calmly confronted her about the misuse of the funds, she cried again, called me toxic, and accused me of weaponizing my wealth to control her joy. My parents, naturally, took her side. telling me I needed to be more forgiving of a young woman trying to find herself. The irony of their accusations was thick enough to choke on. They accused me of weaponizing wealth, yet they had absolutely no concept of the actual power I yielded every single day. They assumed my lack of ostentatious display meant a lack of significant income or authority. They genuinely believed I was just a mid-level office manager, endlessly pushing meaningless papers in a gray cubicle. I never bothered to correct them. I preferred the camouflage. True power does not need to scream for attention on the internet. They did not know that I held the title of Chief Risk and Integration Officer at Halcyon Transit Group. My job was not about fetching coffee, organizing team-building exercises, or managing office supplies. When Halcyon decided to swallow another struggling, mismanaged logistics firm, I was the apex predator they sent in first. I led the elite forensic teams that tore mercilessly through the target company's books. I was the executive who identified the operational rot, the embezzlers, the fraudulent contracts, and the massive liabilities before the ink on the multi-million-dollar acquisition papers ever dried. I was the one who decided who stayed and who was immediately terminated without severance. The current target on my chopping block was Northvale Freight Systems. Northvale was a bloated, highly inefficient regional player, and Grant Holloway was one of their loudest, most arrogant regional directors. He walked around his territory thinking he was an invincible titan of industry because he could bully independent truck drivers and manipulate his quarterly revenue projections to look slightly better than they actually were. He had absolutely no idea that Northvale was in the final, highly confidential stages of being entirely devoured by Halcyon. He did not know that his company was effectively dead, just waiting for the official announcement. Standing alone in my quiet apartment, looking down at the city lights, the initial sting of their Thanksgiving rejection began to mutate into something entirely different. Being exiled from the holiday table was no longer a personal wound to nurse. It was a tremendous, unforeseen tactical advantage. The physical distance gave me a profound, undisturbed silence to observe them. I watched my family enthusiastically and blindly align themselves with a man who was nothing more than a poorly constructed house of cards. They actively chose the loud illusion of a wealthy son-in-law over the daughter who had constantly been their silent, unfailing savior. They were entirely captivated by a man whose professional survival, completely unbeknownst to him, currently rested entirely on my desk, waiting for my signature. I realized I did not need to fight for a seat at their table anymore. I was already the one who owned the room. Thanksgiving morning arrived in Boston with a bitter wind coming off the harbor, but inside my apartment, the climate was controlled, quiet, and perfectly still. I did not spend the day wallowing in the shadows of my living room, mourning the loss of a family dinner that I usually had to fund anyway. I did not crave the smell of roasted turkey or the sound of forced laughter echoing through a crowded house. Instead, I brewed a double shot of espresso, tied my hair back, and sat down in front of my dual monitors. The screens bathed my face in a pale, clinical light. Today was not a holiday for me. It was an uninterrupted opportunity to dismantle an empire from the inside out. For 6 straight hours, I plunged deep into the digital intestines of Northvale Freight Systems. I bypassed the sanitized quarterly summaries and went straight for the raw, bleeding data. I cross-referenced their operational reports with their external vendor contracts. I scrutinized their fleet maintenance logs, hunting for the tiny, microscopic inconsistencies that always precede a massive financial hemorrhage. I was looking at fuel surcharges that did not align with state mileage tracking. I was analyzing reimbursement journals that seemed suspiciously bloated for a mid-tier regional logistics provider. The work was rhythmic, demanding, and deeply satisfying. It required a level of focus that my family could never comprehend. It was around 3 in the afternoon when the absolute silence of my office was broken by a sharp chime from my mobile device. It was a notification from a social media platform. Against my better judgment, I tapped the glass screen. Vanessa was broadcasting a live video stream to her followers. The environment she was showcasing was a stark contrast to my minimalist, silent office. She was standing in the vaulted lobby of a hyper-exclusive luxury ski resort located deep in Vermont. A massive stone fireplace roared behind her, casting a warm golden glow over her flawless makeup. She was wearing a new, incredibly expensive cashmere sweater and a diamond tennis bracelet that caught the firelight every time she gestured. She turned the camera around to reveal a private dining alcove. The table was dressed in heavy white linen, practically groaning under the weight of a staggering feast. There were elaborate truffle-infused side dishes, imported artisan cheeses, and several bottles of rare, vintage champagne already chilling in hammered silver buckets. Vanessa brought the camera back to her face, her eyes wide with manufactured innocence. She spoke directly to her audience, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. She gushed about how incredibly blessed she was to have a husband who truly knew how to prioritize his family above all else. She stated that Grant had arranged this entire exclusive getaway just to ensure they had a perfect, stress-free holiday away from the noise of the city. Then, her expression shifted. A tiny, cruel smirk played at the corner of her mouth. She leaned into the lens and offered a piece of unsolicited advice to her viewers. She declared that holidays were meant for high-end experiences and making memories, not for sitting alone in a cold apartment staring at a laptop screen. She suggested that some people simply lacked the capacity to understand true luxury because they were too obsessed with control and rules. It was not a subtle dig. It was a heat-seeking missile aimed directly at my Boston zip code. Before I could process the irritation, the camera panned again, bringing my parents into the frame. They were seated by the fire, holding crystal flutes filled with amber liquid. They were laughing uproariously at something out of frame. They looked absolutely ecstatic. They raised their glasses in a toast, their faces shining with pride and validation. It was a sickening portrait of triumph. They looked exactly like a couple who had successfully traded in their heavy, demanding biological daughter for a shiny golden ticket to a life of unearned privilege. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. I reached for the wireless mouse, entirely ready to close the browser window and sever the connection. I had seen enough to confirm their delusions. But right as the cursor hovered over the exit icon, my eyes caught a flicker of movement in the background of the video feed. The camera had drifted slightly to the right, capturing the resort concierge desk located just behind my parents' seating area. Grant was standing there. He was not smiling. His posture was rigid, his shoulders hitched up around his ears. He was engaged in a tense, hushed argument with the resort manager. I leaned closer to my monitor, maximizing the video feed to fill the entire screen. I ignored Vanessa's rambling voice and focused entirely on the background action. Grant was gesturing aggressively, clearly frustrated by some complication with the billing. The manager maintained a polite but immovable stance. Finally, Grant let out a visible sigh of extreme irritation, reached into the inner pocket of his tailored blazer, and pulled out a sleek leather wallet. He extracted a card and slapped it down onto the polished mahogany counter with unnecessary force. The camera angle was just sharp enough, and the streaming resolution just high enough, for me to see the distinct matte black surface of the plastic. More importantly, I saw the geometric, silver emblem embossed in the top right corner. My breath hitched. My hand froze completely on the mouse. That was not a personal platinum bank card. That was not a high-limit consumer credit line meant for affluent individuals. I knew that specific design intimately, because my integration department had spent the last 3 weeks analyzing the exact issuance parameters of those specific accounts. It was a Northvale Freight Systems corporate expense card. It was a Tier 1 administrative account, strictly issued to regional directors for the sole purpose of entertaining vital supply chain clients or covering emergency logistical crises during transit. It was absolutely, categorically forbidden to be used for personal leisure or family vacations. The live stream abruptly ended, the screen fading to black as Vanessa signed off to enjoy her stolen feast, leaving me staring at my own dark reflection in the monitor. I did not waste a single second. I immediately minimized the social media window and opened a secure, encrypted network browser. I accessed the Halcyon Post Audit Integration Portal. This was the highly classified digital backdoor that allowed my executive team to shadow the financial movements of our acquisition targets before the deal ever went public. I bypassed the standard employee login portal and utilized my master executive credentials, passing through two distinct biometric security checkpoints. Once inside the central mainframe, I navigated straight to the Northvale regional expense ledgers. I ran a localized database query, filtering the raw data by grant-specific employee identification number. Then, I narrowed the search parameters to display only pending banking authorizations initiated within the last 24 hours. The system buffered for 3 agonizing seconds as it pulled the data from the external banking servers. Then, a single, glaring row of data populated the screen. There it was. A pending authorization for a staggering amount, running well into the high 5-figure range. The merchant identification code belonged to the exact luxury ski resort in Vermont I had just seen on the video. I clicked on the itemized breakdown. It was a masterpiece of arrogant, creative accounting. Grant had not simply swiped the corporate card for a basic hotel room. He had billed the private dining experience, the vintage champagne, the spa treatments, and the upgraded penthouse suite under a single, highly fraudulent category. The justification note attached to the transaction read simply as a strategic client retention and networking retreat. He was legally classifying a lavish Thanksgiving vacation with his new wife and her parents as a critical corporate business expense. I sat back in my heavy leather chair, the pale light of the financial data reflecting in my eyes. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. It was the very first time I had smiled all day. The sheer, magnificent stupidity of his arrogance was almost beautiful to witness. My family had banished me from their table because they believed my presence would ruin their aesthetic. They wanted a flawless, high-class holiday free from my scrutinizing gaze and silent judgment. Yet, in their desperate effort to keep me away from the Thanksgiving feast, they had unknowingly placed Grant completely outside of his protective bubble. By excluding me from the trip, Grant felt secure enough to recklessly utilize a corporate lifeline to fund his fake billionaire charade. He truly thought he was untouchable. He thought he had won the family over and secured the ultimate crown of approval. But as I stared at the irrefutable, time-stamped evidence of his financial crime glowing brightly on my screen, I knew the absolute truth. They had locked me out of the dining room to protect him, but Grant had just personally handed me the exact loaded weapon I needed to execute his professional destruction. The impulse to strike immediately was a physical weight in my chest. I had the absolute authority to flag the fraudulent hotel transaction, freeze his corporate account, and trigger an automated suspension protocol right then and there. It would have taken less than 60 seconds to send an encrypted directive to the Human Resources Department, effectively terminating his employment before they even ordered dessert in Vermont. But I pulled my hand away from the keyboard. A swift, impulsive reaction was exactly what an emotional, reactive person would do. And I was not emotional. I was a strategist. If I fired him from my living room on a Thursday afternoon, he would immediately spin the narrative. He would call Vanessa, completely frantic, and frame the entire situation as a petty, vindictive attack from a jealous spinster sister. He would convince my parents that I was abusing my corporate connections to ruin his livelihood simply because I was bitter about being uninvited to a holiday meal. It would be entirely reduced to a petty domestic dispute, a classic case of family rivalry, and he would play the ultimate victim. I refused to let him control the narrative. This could not be a family squabble. It had to be a meticulously documented, undeniable corporate execution. I opened the master transition database and located the severance roster. His profile was currently sitting in the automated liquidation pool, scheduled to receive a standard termination package via certified mail next week. I clicked on his identification number and manually changed his disposition status. I removed him from the immediate cut list and dragged his file into a highly restricted, red-coded category labeled for direct executive review. By doing this, I guaranteed that he would not simply fade away quietly into the background. He would be legally required to present himself in person before the new acquisition board. With the trap set, I initiated a secure conference call with my senior risk management team. It was late on a holiday, but my division was compensated exceptionally well to be available at all times. I gave them his specific regional identifier and issued a single, clear directive. I wanted a forensic deep dive into every single operational metric under his command for the past 36 months. I told them to ignore the superficial travel expenses and look directly at the heavy machinery of his territory. I wanted to see the freight routing logs, the diesel fuel consumption approvals, and the third-party vendor contracts. While my family was undoubtedly raising their glasses to their own fabricated superiority, my team was tearing his professional life down to the studs. The preliminary results began populating my secure dashboard just past midnight, and the data was breathtaking. The fraudulent luxury hotel bill was nothing but a microscopic scratch on the surface of a massive, systemic infection. We uncovered a deeply entrenched pattern of manipulated shipping route codes. He was intentionally misclassifying standard freight as expedited priority, charging the clients premium rates, and funneling the difference into a convoluted web of departmental bonuses that he personally controlled. Furthermore, we found massive irregularities in the regional fuel surcharges. He was reporting diesel consumption at rates that physically did not match the mileage tracked by the fleet GPS systems. But the most glaring red flag, the piece of evidence that elevated this from simple theft to federal fraud, was a series of recurring, exorbitant wire transfers to a completely unknown, independent fleet maintenance contractor. The payments were too frequent, the invoices lacked detailed service descriptions, and the approval signatures were entirely consolidated under his name. It was textbook embezzlement. He was bleeding the company dry to fund the very lifestyle that had so thoroughly mesmerized my parents. Throughout the entire weekend, my mobile phone became a relentless beacon of their arrogance. The family group chat buzzed every few hours with a new barrage of high-resolution gloating. There were panoramic photos of snow-capped mountains, close-ups of crystal wine glasses clinking together, and videos of Vanessa twirling in expensive winter gear. My parents sent lengthy messages praising the spectacular ambiance, continually marveling at how refreshing it was to be surrounded by genuine positivity and true success. They were not just sharing their vacation. They were actively weaponizing their joy, sending pointed, venomous jabs designed to remind me of my exclusion. Vanessa posted a long paragraph about how toxic family members hold you back from your true potential, and how grateful she was to be surrounded by high-value individuals. I read every single message. I looked at every single photograph, and I did absolutely nothing. I did not send a sarcastic reply. I did not text my mother to expose the truth about the corporate card. I did not threaten Vanessa. I offered them absolute, unbroken silence. To a family that thrived on drama and emotional reactions, my silence was the ultimate confirmation of their victory. By Sunday evening, they were entirely convinced that I was sitting alone in the dark, thoroughly humiliated, weeping over my own miserable existence. They thought they had finally broken my spirit and established a new, superior hierarchy with him at the absolute top. They had no idea that my silence was not a surrender. It was the quiet focus of a predator calculating the exact angle of the final strike. Sunday night was spent finalizing the architectural layout of his destruction. Monday morning was the official commencement of the Transition Summit. The highest-ranking executives from Halcyon were flying into our Boston headquarters to physically take control of the newly acquired assets. All regional directors from the absorbed company were mandated to attend an introductory briefing. He would be there, wearing one of his expensive, custom-tailored suits, armed with his slick corporate vocabulary, entirely ready to charm his new corporate overlords. He was walking into the building fully believing he was an indispensable asset, a rainmaker who carried the revenue of an entire geographic territory on his shoulders. He was expecting to negotiate a massive retention bonus. He was expecting respect and unwavering power. My plan was crystallized and flawless. He would not lose his job in a random hallway. He would not be escorted out by a low-level security guard after reading a cowardly digital notification. He was going to walk into the highest tier of corporate authority, expecting a coronation, only to realize he had deeply and fatally insulted the wrong woman. I was going to let him step fully into the light, right at the exact moment his entire world collapsed, ensuring there were absolutely no shadows left for him to hide in. The forensic files were printed, bound in heavy black leather folders, and locked securely in my briefcase. I set my alarm for 5 in the morning, laid out my sharpest charcoal suit, and went to sleep with a heart rate so steady it could have been carved from ice. The elevator doors parted on the 42nd floor precisely at 8 in the morning. I stepped onto the thick charcoal carpet of the executive suite, leaving the noise of the Boston traffic far below. The halcyon boardroom was meticulously designed to intimidate anyone who crossed its threshold. It was a cavernous space encased entirely in tinted black glass, dominated by a massive mahogany table polished to a flawless mirror finish. The air conditioning was set to a crisp, unforgiving temperature. At each seating position rested a thick leather-bound dossier, each one heavily stamped with red classified ink. I took my place at the absolute head of the table. I arranged my perfectly aligned pens, smoothed the lapels of my tailored blazer, and rested my hands lightly on the cool wood. 15 minutes later, the heavy double doors swung open. The regional management team from Northvale Freight Systems filtered into the room. They walked with the loud, oblivious swagger of men who firmly believed they were conquering heroes rather than newly acquired corporate assets. Leading the pack, practically strutting across the expensive carpet, was Grant. He was wearing a custom navy suit and a vibrant silk tie, projecting the exact same arrogant dominance he used to captivate my parents. His voice boomed across the acoustic ceiling panels as he boasted loudly to a junior colleague trailing behind him. He aggressively declared that the new acquisition board would have no choice but to double his compensation package to keep him around. He claimed, with complete unearned confidence, that he personally held the revenue streams for an entire coastal region together with his bare hands. He strode toward the center of the room, still looking over his shoulder, soaking up the forced, nervous laughter of his subordinates. Then, he turned his head forward, and his eyes landed squarely on me. He stopped dead in his tracks. A look of total bewilderment flashed across his meticulously tanned face, but it was almost instantly replaced by a wide, fiercely patronizing grin. He actually laughed out loud, the sound echoing harshly off the glass walls. He looked back at his colleagues, pointing a manicured finger directly at my face. He loudly asked the room if his new wife had sent her quiet, boring sister all the way downtown just to fetch their morning coffee. He sauntered closer, leaning his weight casually against the back of one of the expensive leather chairs. He told me to make sure I took highly accurate minutes for the real executives today. He threw in a deeply condescending remark about how administrative note-taking perfectly suited my submissive personality, loudly asserting his dominance as if we were back in my mother's living room, and I was just an annoyance in his peripheral vision. I did not blink. I did not offer a polite, accommodating smile. I certainly did not offer a defensive retort. I simply sat there perfectly still and let the silence stretch. I let it stretch for 10 agonizing seconds, then 20, then 30. I watched the residual laughter from his colleagues slowly die in their throats. The atmosphere in the massive room began to plummet in temperature. The smug, victorious grin on his face faltered slightly, his eyes darting frantically around the room as he suddenly realized that absolutely none of the armed Halcyon security personnel standing by the walls, nor any of the support staff, were stepping forward to ask me to leave. I waited until the absolute quiet felt like a physical, crushing weight pressing down on their chests. With a single, smooth, deliberate motion, I reached under the lip of the mahogany table and pressed a hidden security button. The heavy magnetic locks on the secondary doors engaged with a loud, definitive click, sealing the room entirely. Another press of a button sent the motorized blackout blinds gliding down over the exterior windows, plunging the room into artificial twilight. Finally, the massive presentation screen mounted on the wall behind me descended from the ceiling with a low mechanical hum. I picked up a silver laser pointer and clicked it on. The screen illuminated the darkened room with the new, highly classified organizational hierarchy of the merged corporation. At the very top apex of the chart, reigning completely over the entire integration, risk management, and post-acquisition personnel approval division, was my name, Morgan Morales, Chief Risk and Integration Officer. A thick, solid red line connected every single regional management tier directly up to my office. The reporting line for his specific name was displayed in bold, undeniable font, terminating exactly at my desk. The physical shift in the room was violent and instantaneous. The other Northvale managers stiffened, their postures snapping to rigid attention as their brains simultaneously processed the lethal reality of the power dynamic. They immediately stepped away from him, physically distancing themselves from a man they suddenly recognized as a massive liability. He stood completely paralyzed. The blood drained entirely from his face, leaving him looking sickly and hollow. He opened his mouth, but absolutely no sound came out. The grand illusion of his supreme authority, the fake empire he had built to impress my family, shattered into a million irreparable pieces in the span of a few excruciating seconds. He swallowed hard, a visible bead of sweat forming at his temple. He attempted to force a desperate, breathy chuckle, his voice cracking violently in the quiet room. He looked wildly at the other executives, stammering defensively that this had to be some sort of insane, unprofessional joke. He pointed a shaking finger at me and loudly accused me of staging a personal vendetta because of a petty family misunderstanding over a holiday dinner. He desperately tried to convince the silent room that I was deeply unstable, claiming I was abusing a corporate loophole simply to settle a domestic score because I was jealous of his marriage. I ignored his pathetic, frantic outburst completely. I calmly reached out and opened the heavy black leather folder resting in front of me. I withdrew a thick stack of high-resolution prints. It was the complete, itemized corporate expense report from the Vermont Luxury Resort, pulled directly from his Tier 1 administrative account. I slid the documents across the polished table, the paper hissing against the wood, letting them come to a rest exactly in front of his empty chair. I instructed him to take a seat. My voice was calm, devoid of any anger, which only made the command more terrifying. I told him to look at the paperwork and provide a logical, business-related explanation for every single charge he had approved. I read the figures aloud, letting my voice carry clearly to the very back of the room so every single one of his peers could hear his crimes. I asked him to explain exactly how a $12,000 charge for a penthouse suite benefited our regional supply chain logistics. I demanded to know the strategic corporate value of $3,000 spent on vintage champagne and artisan truffles during a critical quarter. I inquired which vital freight clients he was supposedly entertaining during a $5,000 couple's spa retreat on Thanksgiving afternoon. Every single word I spoke was a nail driven directly into his professional coffin. His colleagues stared at him in horrified silence. He was publicly exposed, stripped of his expensive armor, and completely cornered by the exact same woman he had mocked and belittled just minutes prior. He gripped the edge of the heavy table, his knuckles turning stark white against the wood. He had absolutely nothing to say. There was no slick marketing spin, no charismatic smile, and no arrogant boast that could possibly justify federal corporate theft. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a sudden suffocating terror. He finally understood the absolute magnitude of his mistake. He realized he had not just insulted a quiet sister-in-law, he had declared war on his executioner. I let him drown in the silence for a moment longer before I closed my leather folder with a sharp snap that echoed through the room like a gunshot. I looked directly into his panicked eyes, holding his gaze until he physically flinched, and delivered the final, devastating blow. I informed the entire room that this mandatory meeting was not a standard termination hearing. I declared, with absolute authority, that no one was simply being fired today. Instead, I announced that this morning marked the official commencement of a massive, multi-agency investigation into systemic financial fraud, deliberate embezzlement, and the intentional manipulation of operational transport documents within his specific region. The boardroom emptied with the chaotic energy of a sinking ship. The regional managers scrambled for the exits, desperate to distance themselves from the blast radius. Grant was escorted to a temporary holding office by two silent security contractors. It took him less than 45 minutes to weaponize his panic. He bypassed corporate protocol entirely and made a frantic, desperate phone call directly to my sister. He twisted the narrative with the practiced skill of a lifelong manipulator. He did not confess to the fraudulent invoices or the stolen corporate funds. Instead, he painted a masterpiece of victimhood. He told Vanessa that I had ambushed him, leveraging my newly revealed executive position to orchestrate a completely baseless, vindictive witch hunt. He convinced her that I was actively destroying his flawless career simply because my fragile ego could not handle being excluded from their perfect Thanksgiving dinner. The fallout hit my headquarters exactly at 11:30 in the morning. The secure console on my desk illuminated with a high-priority alert from the ground floor security desk. The chief of security sounded remarkably tense. He informed me that a woman claiming to be my mother was currently tearing through the main atrium and refusing to leave without seeing me. I did not ask them to remove her forcefully. I took the private executive elevator down to the lobby. The halcyon atrium was a vast, echoing chamber of white marble and sheer glass. My mother was standing dead center, a magnificent spectacle of completely misplaced righteous fury. She was wearing a brand-new, highly recognizable Italian cashmere coat, a garment that easily cost more than her boutique made in an entire month. The moment the elevator doors parted and she saw me, she lost whatever thin veneer of civility she had left. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my chest. Her voice echoed off the high ceilings, drawing the stares of dozens of visiting executives, analysts, and support staff. She screamed that I was a jealous, spiteful spinster who could not stand to see anyone else happy. She demanded, with absolute, blind entitlement, that I immediately march back upstairs, drop the fake corporate investigation, and publicly restore the pristine reputation of the man she proudly called the husband of my sister. She accused me of trying to tear apart a beautiful marriage out of pure, unadulterated bitterness. I walked slowly across the marble floor, stopping only when I was standing firmly inside her personal space. I did not raise my voice. I did not match her frantic, emotional pitch. I kept my tone perfectly level, dropping my voice to a sharp, icy whisper that only she could hear. I told her to look down at her own sleeves. I calmly informed her that the incredibly expensive designer coat currently keeping her warm was highly likely purchased using funds directly embezzled through a fraudulent intermediary contractor account. I explained that she was literally standing in the lobby of a multi-billion-dollar corporation wearing stolen criminal evidence. All the aggressive, burning color instantly vanished from her cheeks, leaving her face a pale, sickly white. She stood completely paralyzed, her mouth opening and closing silently as the absolute horror of my words sank in. Before she could recover her voice or cause a further scene, my security team gently but firmly flanked her. They escorted her through the revolving glass doors and out into the biting Boston wind before I was legally forced to call the local police department to have her arrested for trespassing. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the coordinated retaliation campaign shifted to a digital front. My personal cellular phone became a toxic, vibrating wasteland of familial abuse. The extended family, riled up by my mother and Vanessa, unleashed a relentless assault. Aunts, uncles, and cousins from both sides of the family tree flooded my inbox with vicious, condemning text messages. They called me a heartless corporate machine. They accused me of tearing our loving family apart just to win a petty, imaginary competition. They painted Vanessa and Grant as innocent, hard-working martyrs suffering underneath the heel of my ruthless, unforgiving jealousy. They told me I was a disgrace to our family name. I read the first few paragraphs and then calmly muted the entire device. I did not type a single letter in response. I did not attempt to present them with the logical facts or the financial evidence. Engaging in a defensive argument with a mob completely addicted to their own comforting delusions was a massive waste of my cognitive energy. Let them believe I was the villain. Let them cling to their shiny false idol for a few more days. I placed the phone face down inside a heavy desk drawer and locked it. I shifted my entire focus back to the only thing that mattered: the cold, undeniable data. I summoned the lead forensic auditor into my office and ordered a massive expansion of our search parameters. We needed to stop looking at the superficial travel expenses and start digging into the heavy systemic bleeding within his regional supply chain. I directed his attention to a specific third-party vendor named Ridgeline Fleet Support. This particular entity had consistently received massive, highly irregular payouts from the exact geographical region he controlled. The payments were categorized as emergency maintenance and yard coordination fees, but the frequency and the dollar amounts made absolutely no logical sense for a fleet of that size. For the next 3 hours, my team aggressively tore apart the digital footprint of Ridgeline Fleet Support. The results were utterly damning. The vendor was nothing more than a carefully constructed phantom. We discovered that the registered corporate headquarters was just a virtual mailbox located inside a dilapidated strip mall 2 states away. They possessed no physical equipment, no payroll records for mechanics, and no actual service trucks. They provided absolutely zero tangible services to the company. Yet, for the past 24 months, they had successfully billed the logistics firm for hundreds of thousands of dollars. It was a textbook shell company, a financial black hole designed strictly to siphon massive amounts of cash out of the operational budget and launder it into private accounts. To solidify the fraud case for federal authorities, we needed the foundational legal documents. I ordered a high-priority rush retrieval of the original state incorporation filings for Ridgeline Fleet Support. 45 minutes later, the heavily encrypted file landed in my secure inbox. I opened the digital document, my eyes scanning past the standard legal boilerplate, searching for the primary registrant's signature. I fully expected to see a forged name, a hired proxy, or perhaps his own name acting under a thin corporate disguise. What I actually saw printed on the final page made the blood freeze solid in my veins. The name typed on the legal ownership line, accompanied by a perfectly clear, digitally verified signature, did not belong to him. The sole proprietor, the legal mastermind on paper, who had officially established the fraudulent entity to launder stolen corporate money, was Vanessa Morales Holloway. The air in my office suddenly felt incredibly thin and suffocating. I sat back in my heavy leather chair, staring blankly at my sister's signature glowing on the monitor. A deep, chilling realization washed over me. I finally understood the terrifying reality of the situation. This was no longer just a satisfying corporate execution of an arrogant, toxic brother-in-law. The chessboard had violently expanded, consuming everything I thought I knew. I was actively hunting a sophisticated federal criminal fraud network, and my own flesh and blood had eagerly signed up to be the legal architect. The counterattack did not come from a courtroom or a lawyer's office. It came through the digital ether, launched with the desperate, flailing energy of a cornered animal. By 6 o'clock on Wednesday morning, my corporate mobile device began vibrating with a relentless, rhythmic intensity. The public relations department was in a state of absolute panic. Grant, realizing the sheer gravity of the federal trap closing around him, had decided to play his final, most chaotic card. He had leaked a heavily fabricated, anonymous manifesto to a prominent financial blog known for aggressively tearing down corporate mergers. The headline was a masterpiece of character assassination. It accused Halcyon Transit Group of gross negligence, claiming the executive board was allowing personal family vendettas to derail a multi-million-dollar acquisition. The article painted a vivid, entirely fictional picture of an anonymous whistleblower, a highly successful regional director, who had supposedly uncovered severe compliance issues within the transition. According to the hit piece, instead of listening to this heroic director, the company had unleashed a bitter, deeply conflicted female executive to silence him. The article explicitly detailed how this executive was abusing her power to fabricate embezzlement charges against her own brother-in-law, simply to settle a domestic grudge over a holiday dinner. It was a brilliantly toxic narrative. Within 2 hours, the article had been shared thousands of times across major business networking platforms. The financial news anchors were already debating the ethics of the merger on morning television. Pre-market trading showed our corporate stock dipping by nearly 3%. In the cutthroat world of private equity, the mere perception of a high-level emotional conflict was enough to trigger a catastrophic investor panic. At exactly 8 o'clock, I received a priority summons to the chairman's suite. This was not a standard status update. This was an emergency tribunal. I walked into the massive corner office and found the entire halcyon board of directors waiting for me. The air was thick with tension and expensive cologne. The chief executive officer, a man who usually projected absolute calm, was pacing furiously behind his desk. He did not offer me a seat. He pointed a rigid finger at the tablet displaying the viral article. He demanded to know why the company was suddenly the center of a humiliating public soap opera. The board members were terrified about the stock volatility and the sudden stain on the acquisition's credibility. The consensus in the room was swift and brutal. They wanted to immediately remove me from the integration project, place me on indefinite administrative leave, and issue a public statement distancing the corporation from the entire familial conflict. They thought I was a liability. They thought I had let my personal life bleed onto their pristine balance sheets. I stood perfectly still, letting their panic burn out for a full 60 seconds before I spoke. I did not raise my voice, nor did I attempt to defend my character. Emotional defense is a sign of weakness. Instead, I reached into my briefcase, pulled out a secure encrypted tablet, and laid it flat on the center of the mahogany conference table. I calmly informed the board that I had fully anticipated a desperate public relations maneuver. A man facing decades in federal prison will always try to burn the building down before the authorities arrive. I tapped the screen, bringing up a high-definition video file. I explained that what they were about to see was captured at 11 o'clock the previous night by the upgraded security grid in the subterranean parking garage of our headquarters. The board members leaned in cautiously. The video began to play. The lighting was stark, illuminating the concrete pillars and the rows of executive vehicles. The camera angle perfectly captured the lead forensic auditor of my integration team walking toward his car. Suddenly, Grant emerged from the shadows, physically blocking the auditor from opening his driver's side door. The audio feed, captured flawlessly by the acoustic sensors we had installed 3 months prior, filled the silent boardroom. Grant was completely unhinged. He was sweating, pacing, and speaking in rapid, frantic bursts. He was not acting like a heroic whistleblower. He was begging. He pleaded with the auditor to access the central mainframe and permanently delete the transaction logs associated with Ridgeline Fleet support. He begged him to alter the minutes of the initial review meeting and completely disable the automated financial checks on the ghost contractor invoices. Then came the death blow. Grant reached into his jacket, pulled out a thick manila envelope, and shoved it against the auditor's chest. His voice cracked as he explicitly offered a bribe of $50,000 in untraceable cash, promising another $50,000 once the federal flags were removed from his name. The video ended. The silence in the chairman's suite was absolute and deafening. The men in the room slowly leaned back in their chairs, the color draining from their faces. The entire atmosphere shifted from accusatory panic to cold, calculated predatory focus. They instantly realized that I was not the source of the risk. I was the only person in the building sober enough to anticipate the crisis and trap the liability on tape. I had handed them irrefutable, high-definition proof of federal witness tampering and corporate bribery. I looked directly at the chief executive officer and instructed him to have our legal counsel send a heavily redacted still frame of that video, along with a formal cease and desist order, directly to the publisher of the financial blog. Within 45 minutes, the digital landscape violently inverted. The anonymous article was pulled down, gutted, and republished with a terrifying new headline. The narrative flipped instantly from a story about a brave whistleblower to a breaking report about a logistics manager currently under federal investigation for massive corporate fraud, bribery, and obstruction of justice. The trap had snapped entirely shut, severing his last possible escape route. Despite the highly public shift in the media, my family remained aggressively chained to their delusions. By mid-afternoon, my father sent me a solitary text message, completely bypassing the chaotic group chats. He asked to meet me in person, alone, at a quiet bench in the Boston Public Garden. He emphasized that it was a matter of absolute life and death. I found him sitting under the bare branches of a massive oak tree, wearing a worn wool coat. He looked incredibly frail, as if he had aged 10 years in the span of 4 days. He did not stand up to greet me. He did not look me in the eye. He just stared at his trembling hands resting on his knees. He did not come to apologize for the Thanksgiving exile. He did not come to commend me for uncovering a massive criminal syndicate. He came because the walls of his own financial reality were collapsing, and he was completely terrified. In a voice barely above a whisper, he confessed a secret that made the frigid Boston air feel utterly suffocating. He told me that when Vanessa and Grant were purchasing their massive, multi-million-dollar luxury mansion the previous year, they had fallen drastically short on the required liquidity for the closing costs and the bank's collateral requirements. Desperate to ensure his golden daughter secured her dream life, my father had quietly gone behind my back. He and my mother had legally pledged their fully paid-off retirement home as the primary collateral guarantor for the mansion's mortgage. If the federal authorities seized Grant's assets, if the bank foreclosed on the mansion due to criminal fraud, my parents would instantly lose the only home they owned. They would be left completely destitute, sleeping on the street to pay for the sins of a con artist. I stared at him, my heart turning into a block of solid ice. I asked him how he could possibly make such an incredibly reckless decision without consulting me, the daughter who had spent her entire adult life managing their financial disasters. He finally looked up, his eyes wide with a pathetic, desperate sorrow. He then delivered the final, most devastating truth. He admitted that the collateral pledge was not the only thing they had done. Years ago, when Vanessa was just starting out and demanding a high-end lifestyle she could not afford, my parents had needed to cover a massive shortfall on her first condo purchase. To fund it, they had secretly gone into the bank and completely liquidated the graduate school college fund they had supposedly been saving for me since I was a child. They drained the entire account to zero. When I asked him why, his voice broke. He told me that Vanessa had always been so fragile. She needed the stability of a beautiful home to feel secure in the world. He said they took my money because they knew I was strong. They knew I was capable. They figured I would always find a way to survive on my own. So they simply sacrificed my future to guarantee her comfort. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not slap him across his weathered face. I just sat there on the cold wooden bench, absorbing the absolute, pure toxicity of my own bloodline. They had not just favored my sister. They had actively cannibalized my life to feed her endless appetite. They had stolen my education fund to buy her a condo, and then risked their own survival to buy her a mansion with a criminal. He reached out, trying to grab my hand, begging me to use my corporate power to stop the investigation, to save Grant so they would not lose the house. He was asking me to commit obstruction to protect the people who had spent decades robbing me blind. I stood up, adjusting my coat against the wind. I looked down at the man who had raised me, feeling absolutely nothing but a profound, liberating emptiness. The last lingering thread of familial duty snapped, dissolving completely into the winter air. The intercom of my building buzzed sharply at exactly 9 o'clock that evening. I did not need to check the security monitor to know who was standing in the freezing lobby. The frantic, sustained pressing of the button was a signature move. I authorized the elevator access and left my front door unlocked, returning to my position by the floor-to-ceiling windows. A few minutes later, Vanessa pushed into my apartment. She was a masterclass in calculated disarray. Her usually immaculate hair was pulled into a messy knot. Her designer mascara was artistically smudged beneath her eyes, and she was wrapped in an oversized, neutral-toned sweater that made her look deliberately small and fragile. She did not say a word at first. She simply stood in the entryway, buried her face in her hands, and began to sob. It was a loud, echoing performance designed to shatter any defensive boundaries I might have held. She stumbled forward and collapsed onto my pale gray sofa, gasping for air between theatrical tears. She swore on her life that she had absolutely no idea what Ridgeline Fleet Support actually was. She claimed she was just a supportive, trusting wife who blindly signed the dense stacks of legal paperwork her husband placed in front of her. She painted herself as the ultimate, naive victim of a complex corporate manipulation she could not possibly comprehend. Then came the ultimate moral shield. She placed both of her hands protectively over her slightly rounded stomach. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and brimming with manufactured terror. She begged me to think of the innocent life growing inside her. She pleaded with me not to be the monster who sent the father of her unborn child to a federal penitentiary. It was the exact emotional leverage she had used to manipulate our parents for her entire life. A demand for unconditional surrender wrapped in the guise of family loyalty. I remained standing by the glass, entirely unmoved. The temperature in the room felt absolute zero. I walked over to the marble kitchen island, picked up a thin manila folder, and dropped it onto the glass coffee table right in front of her knees. I told her to stop performing. My voice was completely flat, devoid of any sympathy. I did not raise my voice, but the quiet authority in my tone made her sobbing falter instantly. I instructed her to open the folder. Inside were the printed copies of the digital footprint she thought she had successfully erased. I did not speak in vague accusations. I laid out the exact, undeniable chronology. I pointed to the printed emails she had personally sent to the commercial banking representatives, using her own verified digital signature to authorize the establishment of the corporate accounts. I showed her the highlighted bank routing numbers that proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that the fraudulent vendor payouts did not just vanish into a void. I traced the money directly from the Ridgeline business ledger straight into her primary consumer checking account. I detailed how she had personally wired tens of thousands of dollars of stolen logistics funds to purchase her imported living room furniture, her custom winter wardrobe, and the incredibly expensive luxury vehicle currently sitting in her driveway. She was not a blind, naive wife. She was the active, enthusiastic money launderer for a federal embezzlement scheme. The transformation was breathtaking. The moment she realized the victim narrative was entirely useless, the tears stopped, as if a faucet had been violently cranked shut. The fragile, terrified posture vanished. She sat up perfectly straight, her jaw clenching, her eyes narrowing into cold, venomous slits. The mask completely dissolved, revealing the ruthless, entitled core I had always known was there. She looked at me with pure, unadulterated disgust. She sneered, her voice dropping the frantic pitch and turning into a razor-sharp blade. She told me I was nothing but a pathetic, bitter woman consumed by jealousy. She stated that I was deliberately destroying her perfect life because I could never achieve one of my own. She claimed our parents loved her more because she was warm, beautiful, and capable of being loved, while I was just a cold, calculating machine who only knew how to hoard money and judge others. She said I was dying entirely alone inside my pristine, empty apartment, and ruining her marriage was my twisted way of feeling powerful. She stood up, grabbing her designer handbag. Before she walked out the door, she turned back and delivered a final, desperate threat. She informed me that her husband was not a man who went down without a fight. She warned that he had prepared a final, catastrophic option. She promised that if I did not officially retract my forensic report by the following morning, he would detonate a scandal so massive it would permanently strip me of my executive title and destroy my entire professional reputation. She slammed the heavy door behind her, leaving the apartment in a ringing silence. I did not lose a single second of sleep. The retaliation arrived at exactly 7 o'clock the next morning. It was a highly coordinated, vicious smear campaign launched across several prominent anonymous industry message boards and corporate gossip networks. The posts were vile. They accused me of engaging in highly unethical, illicit romantic relationships with external contractors. The anonymous author claimed I had personally altered bidding protocols and manipulated vendor contracts to enrich myself and my supposed lovers. It was a blatant, desperate attempt to destroy my credibility and force the Halcyon board to terminate me before the federal authorities could finalize their warrants. I did not panic. I did not issue a frantic public denial. I simply made one phone call to the chief of our cybersecurity division. I authorized the immediate deployment of our most aggressive digital tracing protocols. The anonymous accounts had utilized basic encryption masking, a tactic that might have fooled a standard human resources department, but it was entirely useless against a corporate intelligence apparatus designed to protect multi-billion-dollar acquisitions. Within 2 hours, my legal and technical teams had successfully pierced the digital veil. They traced the origin of the posts, tracking the unique media access control address directly back to a specific router. The malicious, career-ending rumors had been authored and uploaded using the private wireless network originating from inside the massive luxury estate owned by Vanessa and her husband. I forwarded the completely unredacted tracing report directly to the federal investigators who were already building the fraud case. Adding a documented charge of corporate defamation and witness intimidation to their growing list of federal crimes was the final nail. While they were busy typing anonymous lies on the internet, the real-world consequences were silently locking into place. At exactly 10 o'clock that morning, a federal judge signed the emergency injunctions based on the forensic evidence my team had provided. The legal machinery moved with terrifying invisible speed. Every single bank account associated with Ridgeline Fleet Support was immediately frozen. The commercial holds quickly cascaded into their personal lives. The joint checking accounts, the high-yield savings, the investment portfolios tied to his name, they were all completely locked down by federal mandate. The wealth they had flaunted so aggressively ceased to exist in a matter of seconds. Vanessa, completely oblivious to the silent financial execution occurring behind the scenes, had decided to flee the pressure cooker. She packed 2 oversized designer suitcases, called an elite black car service, and headed straight to the international airport. She planned to fly out to a high-end island resort, a place where she could drink expensive sparkling water and play the wealthy victim while her husband supposedly fixed the mess back in Boston. She strolled up to the first-class ticketing counter, completely expecting the world to bow to her aesthetic. She handed her premium travel credit card to the airline agent to cover the exorbitant last-minute international fare. The machine beeped. The transaction was declined, visibly irritated. She pulled out a secondary platinum card, loudly complaining about banking errors and inconveniencing premium clients. The agent swiped it, declined. She tried a third card, a debit card tied to their primary checking account, declined. The airline agent, maintaining a polite but firm customer service smile, informed her that every single payment method attached to her profile was returning a severe institutional hold code. She was standing in the middle of a crowded terminal, surrounded by impatient travelers, completely unable to purchase a single cup of coffee, let alone a first-class ticket to paradise. Humiliated and suddenly terrified, she stepped away from the counter and pulled out her phone. She desperately started calling her wealthy social circle, the exact same women she had paraded in front of me for years. She needed a quick loan, a temporary lifeline, just enough cash to escape the city. But the news of the Halcyon corporate scandal and the looming federal investigation had already ripped through their insular, status-obsessed network. She called 5 different friends. Every single call went straight to a sterile voicemail. The people who had happily drank her stolen vintage wine and lounged on her fraudulently purchased furniture were now treating her like a highly contagious disease. In the span of a single morning, the glittering, untouchable world she had built entirely on lies and my stolen future had completely, utterly evaporated. The invitation arrived via a stiffly worded email from my father. It was framed as a desperate plea for a peaceful resolution. They wanted a family reconciliation dinner at a highly exclusive French dining room nestled deep in the historic Back Bay neighborhood. I knew instantly that it was an ambush. The media tide had turned violently against them, and the federal freeze on their assets was absolute. They were trapped in a corner, out of money, out of leverage, and out of time. I accepted the invitation. I did not go to make peace or to accept an apology. I went because I wanted to watch the final, desperate act of their play. I wanted to see the absolute truth of who they were when every single layer of their artificial privilege was permanently stripped away. I arrived at precisely 8 o'clock in the evening. The restaurant was a fortress of quiet luxury, smelling faintly of brown butter, fresh orchids, and old money. The host led me to a private dining alcove tucked away behind heavy velvet curtains. They were already seated. The contrast between the opulent setting and their physical condition was jarring. Grant looked entirely hollowed out. His previously immaculate tan had faded into a sickly, ashen pallor. The designer suit he wore hung slightly loose on his frame, as if the sheer stress of the last 72 hours had physically consumed his muscle mass. Vanessa stared fixedly at her empty plate. Her usual arrogant posture completely collapsed. My parents flanked them like exhausted, terrified bodyguards bracing for an impact. The table was already crowded with the evidence of their premature celebration. Towering silver platters of imported oysters and chilled lobster tails sat entirely untouched. 3 bottles of exceptionally rare Bordeaux wine were breathing in heavy crystal decanters. They had ordered a feast fit for royalty, operating under the arrogant, delusional assumption that this dinner would end in my total surrender. I took my seat directly across from Grant. When the waiter approached, I ordered a single glass of sparkling water with lemon. Grant attempted to summon his old corporate charisma, but his voice lacked its usual booming resonance. It sounded thin and desperate. He leaned forward, clasping his hands together in a practiced gesture of sincerity. He told me that this entire situation had spiraled completely out of control. He used sanitized corporate words like administrative oversight and unfortunate systemic glitches. He tried to spin the massive, multi-tiered embezzlement scheme as a simple misunderstanding between regional accounting departments. He spoke softly, adopting the tone of an exhausted peacemaker trying to bridge a gap between 2 stubborn sides. Then, he slowly slid a thick, cream-colored document across the linen tablecloth. It was legally drafted, completely devoid of any familial warmth or actual remorse. He explained that all I needed to do to fix everything was sign the paper. He framed it as a noble, necessary sacrifice to save the honor and the future of our family. But I read the text. It was not an apology. It was a binding, highly toxic legal declaration. The document explicitly required me to state on the official record that my forensic findings were fundamentally flawed, that the financial irregularities were mere operational misunderstandings, and that I formally retracted all cooperation with federal investigators. Signing it would not just clear his name, it would permanently destroy my professional credibility, expose me to corporate perjury charges, and end my entire career in spectacular disgrace. The moment I finished reading the paper, my parents launched their coordinated assault. My mother reached across the table, her eyes wide with a frantic, begging intensity. She pleaded with me to be the bigger person, to show mercy, to remember that blood was supposed to be thicker than corporate policy. When I remained completely silent, the begging rapidly devolved into vicious, cornered blame. My father slammed his fist lightly against the table, his face flushed with panicked anger. He hissed that if I did not sign that paper tonight, they would lose absolutely everything. He reminded me of the collateral pledge on their retirement home. He told me that their impending homelessness would be entirely my fault. They were fully prepared to sacrifice my freedom and my reputation just to keep the federal agents away from their front door. I looked at the 4 of them. They were completely united in their absolute willingness to destroy me for their own comfort. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored blazer and retrieved my heavy silver fountain pen. The collective breath in the private alcove caught. I saw Grant let out a tiny, suppressed sigh of relief. My mother closed her eyes, silently thanking her lucky stars that she had finally bullied her resilient daughter into submission. They genuinely believed I was going to cave to the pressure, just as I had always done in the past. I uncapped the pen. The gold nib gleamed under the soft chandelier light. I pressed the tip to the thick paper, right above the designated signature line. I did not sign my name. I did not write a retraction. Drawing upon the absolute stillness inside me, I wrote 3 large, bold words across the center of the legal document. See you in court. I capped the pen and pushed the document back across the table. Grant stared at the wet black ink. It took a full 5 seconds for his brain to process the catastrophic failure of his final gamble. When he finally looked up at me, the last remaining shred of his gentlemanly facade shattered completely. He exploded. He leaped out of his chair, the heavy mahogany legs scraping violently against the hardwood floor. He lost his mind entirely. He screamed at the top of his lungs, the sound tearing through the elegant quiet of the restaurant. He called me a heartless, cold-blooded machine. He hurled vile insults at my character and my life. He blamed me for every single failure he had ever committed, projecting his own criminal rot onto my absolute refusal to save him. He was no longer a slick corporate director. He was a trapped, terrified fraud throwing a childish, destructive tantrum. Vanessa began to sob loudly, covering her ears, while my parents sat frozen in absolute, undeniable horror at the monster they had blindly championed. Right at the peak of his screaming fit, the velvet curtains parted. The restaurant manager stepped into the room, his face a perfect mask of polite professional disdain. He was flanked by 2 large, silent security guards. He did not ask Grant to calm down. Instead, he carried a silver tray holding a small black leather book, the final bill. The manager calmly stated that given the severe disruption, they would need to conclude the evening immediately. He placed the heavy leather book directly in front of Grant. The total for the imported seafood, the vintage Bordeaux, and the private room rental was astronomical. It was well over $4,000. Grant snatched up the bill, still breathing heavily, and aggressively threw his premium corporate credit card onto the tray. The manager did not even blink. He quietly informed Grant that the card, along with the 2 other personal cards they had attempted to run earlier in the evening to pre-authorize the extravagant meal, had all been severely declined with a federal lock code. There was no money. The accounts were entirely frozen. They had ordered a king's feast to celebrate my downfall, and they did not possess a single functioning dollar to pay for it. The silence that followed was absolute and crushing. The horrifying reality of their poverty finally crashed down upon them. My father looked wildly at his own wallet, knowing his accounts were likely caught in the collateral freeze. Vanessa stared at the lobster tails as if they were poisonous. They were completely paralyzed by the sheer humiliation of being unable to pay the check in one of the most exclusive dining rooms in the city. I calmly stood up from the table. I smoothed the lapels of my blazer and picked up my purse. I opened my wallet, extracted a crisp $20 bill, and placed it neatly next to my untouched glass of sparkling water. I told the manager that the cash covered my beverage, and the rest of the party would handle their own astronomical debt. I did not look back as I walked out of the private alcove. I left them drowning in their own manufactured ruin, trapped in a room with a massive bill they could not pay, completely stripped of their dignity. I walked through the quiet, scented restaurant, and pushed open the heavy front doors into the freezing Boston night air. I pulled my coat tightly around my shoulders, feeling a profound, incredible sense of lightness. What they did not know, as they sat in that private room staring at a leather binder full of debt, was that the restaurant manager was the least of their problems. They had no idea that waiting quietly in 3 unmarked sedans parked directly across the street were federal agents holding the official signed warrants for his arrest. It took exactly 3 weeks for the final walls of their illusion to buckle. Yet their capacity for denial remained absolutely staggering. Christmas Eve arrived. Despite the completely frozen assets and the suffocating silence from their former high society friends, Vanessa and Grant decided to host a lavish, catered holiday gala at their sprawling estate. They were bleeding out financially, surviving on whatever scattered cash reserves they had hidden under the mattress, but they chose to spend their last remaining dollars on a desperate, glittering facade. They wanted to project strength. They wanted the world to believe that the federal investigation was nothing more than a minor administrative hiccup that they were bravely overcoming. They even hired 2 private security contractors to stand at the end of their long, winding driveway. They provided the guards with my photograph and strict, explicit orders to deny me entry under any circumstances. They were still treating me like the annoying, jealous sister who had been banished from the Thanksgiving table, completely failing to comprehend the monumental shift in power that had already occurred. What they did not know was that the freezing of their accounts had triggered an automatic default on their massive, highly leveraged mortgage. The bank, terrified of the impending criminal seizure of the property, had quietly moved to offload the toxic debt. I did not act as their sister. I acted as a corporate shark. Utilizing a private, anonymously named, limited liability company I controlled, I purchased the entirety of their distressed mortgage directly from the commercial lender. I paid a fraction of the market value, but the legal reality was absolute. I was no longer a relative they could lock out. I was the legal entity that owned the ground they were standing on. I arrived at the estate at exactly 9 o'clock on Christmas night. The air was bitterly cold, and a light snow had begun to fall over the manicured lawns. I pulled my car up to the heavy wrought iron gates. The security guard stepped forward, shining a heavy flashlight through my windshield. He immediately recognized my face from the photograph and gruffly informed me that I was strictly prohibited from entering the premises. I did not argue with him. I rolled down my window and handed him a thick legal portfolio stamped by the county clerk. I calmly instructed him to read the primary injunction. The guard shined his light on the paper, his eyes scanning the dense legal text. He saw the official transfer of the property deed to my corporate entity and the active, highly validated civil enforcement order granting me immediate, unrestricted access to my own asset. The guard swallowed hard, handed the portfolio back to me, and silently pressed the button to open the massive iron gates. I parked my car near the grand entrance and walked up the sweeping stone steps. The heavy mahogany doors were unlocked to welcome their guests. I stepped into the cavernous foyer. The house was decorated with thousands of twinkling lights, towering imported fir trees, and extravagant floral arrangements. It was a beautiful, hollow shell. I walked slowly toward the main living room, following the sound of clinking glass and forced laughter. I stood quietly in the arched doorway. Grant was standing near the massive stone fireplace, holding a crystal flute of champagne. He was wearing a dark velvet dinner jacket, trying desperately to project the image of an untouchable aristocrat. A small crowd of their remaining, uninformed acquaintances was gathered around him. He raised his glass and began to speak. He talked about the trials and tribulations of the past month. He confidently declared that true family always overcomes the bitter, jealous individuals who try to tear them down. He looked at Vanessa, who was wearing a glittering evening gown, and smiled the fake, polished smile of a lifelong con artist. I stepped completely into the room. The guests closest to the door noticed me first, their conversations dying instantly as the temperature in the room seemed to plummet. The silence rippled forward until it reached the fireplace. Grant stopped speaking mid-sentence. His confident smile froze, then slowly contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. Vanessa gasped loudly, taking a sudden step backward, almost dropping her crystal glass. My parents, sitting on a plush sofa nearby, turned completely pale, looking at me as if I were an apparition. I walked straight through the parted crowd, my footsteps echoing against the imported hardwood floor. I stopped directly in front of Grant. I did not say a single word. I simply reached into my coat pocket, pulled out the finalized notice of foreclosure and the immediate eviction mandate, and pressed the heavy legal documents directly against his chest. He reflexively grabbed the papers, staring down at the bold red ink, commanding him to vacate the premises entirely by midnight. Before he could even formulate a coherent sentence, the heavy front doors of the mansion banged open. I had not come alone. 4 uniformed county sheriffs walked purposefully into the grand foyer, their boots loud and heavy against the marble. The lead officer stepped into the living room and loudly announced that they were present to enforce a lawful civil eviction and secure the property on behalf of the new legal owner. The absolute chaos that followed was cinematic. The carefully curated, wealthy guests realized instantly that they were standing in the middle of a massive legal raid. The glamorous facade shattered completely. Men and women in expensive evening wear abandoned their drinks and practically sprinted toward the coat check, desperate to escape the estate before their own names could be attached to the scandal. Within 5 minutes, the massive, glittering house was entirely empty of guests, leaving only my family standing isolated and terrified in the center of the room. Grant stared at the eviction notice, his hands trembling violently. He looked wildly at my father, begging him to do something, anything to stop the nightmare. But the nightmare had not even reached its peak. Right as the last guest drove hastily down the driveway, a set of dark, unmarked sport utility vehicles blocked the main gate. 5 federal agents, wearing dark windbreakers with the letters of their agency printed boldly on the back, walked into the house. They completely ignored the county sheriffs and walked straight toward the fireplace. The lead agent did not offer a polite greeting. He loudly asked for Grant by his full legal name. When Grant could not speak, the agent smoothly pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. He officially stated that Grant was being placed under immediate federal arrest. He rattled off the staggering list of charges in a cold, practiced voice: wire fraud, embezzlement, witness intimidation, corporate bribery. The systemic smear campaign he had launched against me had been the final, fatal addition to his federal indictment. The sound of the metal cuffs ratcheting tightly around his wrists echoed sharply through the quiet room. Vanessa collapsed onto the floor, her glamorous gown pooling around her as she let out a piercing, hysterical scream. My mother buried her face in my father's shoulder, weeping uncontrollably. My father just stared at the floor, completely broken, finally realizing that his retirement home was permanently gone and his golden daughter was married to a convicted felon. The federal agents turned Grant around to escort him out of the mansion. As he was being led away, he stopped and looked directly at me. It was the very first time he had truly seen me. The arrogant, condescending light in his eyes was entirely extinguished. He looked at me with the absolute, terrifying clarity of a man who finally understood the catastrophic magnitude of his mistake. The quiet, boring sister he had so casually banished from his Thanksgiving table was never the outcast. She was the architect of his entire destruction. She was the one holding the master switch that plunged his completely fabricated life into total darkness. I looked back at him, feeling no anger, no pity, and no remorse. I kept my voice perfectly level, ensuring the words would haunt him for the entirety of his prison sentence. I told him that he had banished me a month ago because he claimed my energy ruined the vibe of his holiday party. I took a slow look around the crying family, the armed agents, and the empty, foreclosed mansion. I looked back into his panicked eyes and calmly informed him that my presence tonight had officially canceled his entire show. I turned my back on him before the agents even pushed him out the door. I walked out of the house, got into my car, and drove away from the estate, leaving them behind to deal with the ashes of the fire they had started. That night marked the absolute and permanent end of my relationship with my bloodline. I changed my phone number, relocated my corporate office, and severed every single remaining tie. My greatest victory was not simply orchestrating the downfall of a federal criminal. My true victory was claiming total, unyielding control over my own existence. I refused to ever again be the silent, reliable, sacrificial lamb for people who only remembered my name when they needed someone to save them from their own ruin. I drove back into the city, surrounded by the quiet peace of a life that finally belonged entirely to me. Thank you so much for listening to my story. Please let me know where you are listening from in the comments so we can connect and share our thoughts. And I invite you to subscribe to the Lily Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me further by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.